The year was 683 CE. Makkah stood solemn beneath a darkened sky, as if nature itself braced for something unspeakable. Within its sacred bounds lay the Kaaba, the very heart of Islam, untouched since the time the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had entered the city and cleansed it of idols. Pilgrims continued to arrive. The call to prayer echoed, and the rituals of Hajj were observed. Yet beneath the pious routines, a deep fracture spread through the Ummah, one carved not by disbelievers, but by Muslims themselves, after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The question of leadership had divided the community. What began as differing opinions had grown into something far more dangerous. Decades later, the caliphate had been inherited by Yazid ibn Muawiyah, a man whose very rise represented a shift in the soul of Islamic leadership, from consultation and character to dynasty and domination. His appointment as caliph was not based on piety or the will of the people, but on the ambitions of a ruling house that viewed the faith as a throne rather than a trust. The tragedy of Karbala had already stained Yazid's reign. The brutal killing of Imam Hussain, the grandson of the Prophet, peace be upon him, along with his family and companions, had sent tremors across the Muslim world. News of the massacre reached distant lands, and many who had remained silent began to question the legitimacy of the rule they had once tolerated. Among them stood Abdullah ibn Zubair, a man of Qurayshi blood, son of the noble companion Zubair ibn al-Awwam, and nephew to Aisha. He refused to give bay'ah, allegiance to Yazid, and instead found sanctuary in Makkah. There, under the very shadow of the Kaaba, he called for justice, not merely as a claimant to power, but as a voice of resistance against tyranny. People began to rally around him. Not all supported him out of love. Some sought refuge from Yazid's tightening grip, but Makkah became the heartbeat of opposition. The sanctuary, however, was not enough to deter Yazid. The caliph sent an army led by Hussain ibn Numayr with orders not only to crush the rebellion, but to make a statement. And so, for the first time since the Quraysh had laid siege to the Prophet himself, the Kaaba once again became a target. As the army approached, Makkah's people trembled. They had seen what Yazid's forces had done to Medina, that once protected city, the resting place of the Prophet, peace be upon him, had been violated by the infamous Battle of Al-Hara. Its streets ran red, its people dishonored. Now Makkah awaited the same fate. But Ibn Zubair did not flee. He fortified himself within the precincts of the harem and prepared to defend not just his claim, but the very dignity of the holy city. Then came the unthinkable. Yazid's army laid siege to the Kaaba. They did not hesitate. From the hills surrounding the sanctuary, they launched catapults. Huge stones rained down like divine judgment, but this was not the wrath of God. This was the fury of man, aimed at the house of God. The Kaaba shook under the bombardment. The black drapes were torn, the sacred walls cracked, pilgrims scattered, mothers screamed, and the city mourned. But the most horrifying moment came when one of the fire-tipped projectiles struck the Kaaba directly, setting its wooden scaffold and coverings ablaze. Yes, the Kaaba, the Qibla of the Muslims, the symbol of Tawheed, the place where Ibrahim and Ismail had once stood, was burning. Flames rose into the sky. The smoke could be seen from miles away. People whispered through choked sobs, "Have we returned to the days of Jahiliyyah?" But this was worse. Then the idol worshippers at least feared the wrath of the unseen. Now, men who called themselves Muslims had set the house of God on fire. Inside the city, Ibn Zubair ordered his men to protect the civilians. He tried to extinguish the flames. Water was scarce. The damage was great. But somehow, through the courage of the people and divine mercy, the fire did not consume the entire structure. Still, the Kaaba stood half charred, half shattered, an image seared into the memory of history. What gave this moment its haunting weight was not just the physical destruction, it was the symbol of it all. The Kaaba was not just a building, it was a covenant, a trust that linked the heavens and the earth. The Prophet, peace be upon him, had wept beside it, prayed beneath it, walked around it, and now it had become a battlefield. Many Muslims in distant cities could not comprehend what had occurred. Word of the fire spread like wind through the deserts and mountains. Some refused to believe it, others fell into despair. If even the Kaaba is not safe, they said, what remains sacred? Yazid died shortly after the siege, leaving the Umayyad throne vulnerable. His death was not mourned by the pious, though the damage had been done. His general, Ibn Numayr, attempted to negotiate with Ibn Zubair, urging him to come to terms. But Ibn Zubair refused to acknowledge a dynasty that had brought such devastation upon the faith. And so the standoff continued, not just with weapons, but with ideologies. For a brief time, Makkah was free. Ibn Zubair assumed de facto leadership and made efforts to rebuild the Kaaba. He sought to return it to the form he believed the Prophet, peace be upon him, had intended, based on a narration from Aisha. According to that tradition, the Prophet once told her that had it not been for the newness of the Muslims in faith, he would have rebuilt the Kaaba with 2 doors and included the Hatim area within its walls, as it had been in the time of Prophet Ibrahim. Ibn Zubair, inspired by this, ordered a reconstruction. For the first time in decades, a caliphate not based on inheritance or tyranny appeared to hold the reins in the holiest city of Islam. Yet power never sleeps. The Umayyads regrouped under a new leader, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. Unlike Yazid, Abdul Malik was calculating and politically astute. He sought not merely to restore Umayyad control, but to erase the memory of resistance. He commissioned a new campaign to retake Makkah, and this time there would be no restraint. The second siege began years later, as the Umayyad army advanced again under the command of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, a man infamous for his cruelty and precision. Hajjaj was not interested in negotiations. He considered Ibn Zubair a rebel and Makkah a target. Once more, the city braced for blood. This time, Ibn Zubair was older, his allies fewer. His brothers had been killed, his supporters had dwindled. Still he stood defiant. He gathered his sons, embraced them and prepared for martyrdom. Hajjaj's forces encircled Makkah and began their assault. Catapults were brought out again. Rocks and fire rained upon the Kaaba once more. For the second time, the sacred house faced the wrath of a Muslim army. Within its walls, Ibn Zubair and a handful of defenders fought valiantly, but the odds were overwhelming. As the walls of the city crumbled and his companions fell, Ibn Zubair took refuge near the Kaaba, where he had prayed countless times. He turned his face toward it one last time, not as a politician, but as a believer, as a grandson of those who had once stood beside the Prophet, peace be upon him. He was struck down, his body desecrated, and his head sent to Damascus as a trophy. Kaaba once again had become a witness to injustice. With Ibn Zubair gone, Abdul Malik sought to solidify his power. One of his first acts was to reverse the reconstruction of the Kaaba. He ordered it to be returned to its previous form, not out of religious conviction, but to undo everything Ibn Zubair had done. The house of God was not rebuilt to honor Allah. It was reshaped to erase the memory of resistance. In the aftermath, people continued to visit the Kaaba. The rituals resumed. But the air had changed. The sanctity remained outwardly, but something had shifted deep within. The Kaaba had burned, twice, not by the enemies of Islam, but by those who claimed to defend it. What remained was not just stone and cloth, but a silent testimony of betrayal. For those who truly reflected, this was not just history, it was a warning, a call to ask who protects the Kaaba today, who stands against the tyranny that now wears the garb of religion, and who remembers that once, long ago, fire rained on the house of God, not from the sky, but from hearts darkened by ambition. This was not the end. The fire may have dimmed, but its embers remained glowing beneath the ashes. A new chapter was about to begin, one that would redefine not only the shape of the Kaaba, but the very direction of the Muslim world. Blood on sacred ground, the blood of Abdullah ibn Zubair had barely dried when the sound of hammers and chisels returned to Makkah. Not for worship, but for reconstruction. Not to restore what was lost, but to erase what had stood for defiance. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, now firmly seated on the throne in Damascus, ordered the Kaaba to be demolished and rebuilt according to the form it had before Ibn Zubayr's modifications. Not because one structure was more authentic than the other, but because symbols mattered. Ibn Zubayr had made the Kaaba a banner of resistance, and now it had to be stripped of that memory. The Umayyads wanted control not just over land, but over sacred history. By reversing Ibn Zubayr's changes, Abdul Malik sent a clear message. Rebellion, no matter how righteous, would be buried under stone. But while the Kaaba's physical form changed, the memory of what had happened could not be so easily erased. Those who had witnessed the siege carried the tale forward. They spoke in whispers and in prayer. They recounted how the house of God had been bombarded by Muslims, and how those who stood to defend it had been abandoned by many, yet had refused to bow. Among those who listened were the younger generation, the children who had grown up under the shadow of smoke rising from the Haram. One such figure was Ali ibn Hussain, the lone male survivor of Karbala, known to history as Zayn-ul-Abidin. Though he had not been present during the siege, the news had reached Medina, where he lived in silence and sorrow. For him, the destruction of the Kaaba and the killing of Ibn Zubayr was not an isolated incident. It was yet another symptom of a diseased leadership that had long turned away from the true path. He wept for the Kaaba, as he had wept for his father. He prayed in the night, not for vengeance, but for guidance. And in his du'as, his whispered supplications, he taught that when oppression comes from within, it is the hardest to resist and the most painful to endure. In Damascus, Abdul Malik faced a new challenge. The trauma of Karbala, the desecration of Medina during the Battle of Hara, and now the burning of the Kaaba. These events had fractured public trust in the Umayyads. To restore legitimacy, he turned to propaganda. He employed poets, scholars, and even jurists to sanctify his rule. He sought to unify the people through infrastructure and economic reform, but most significantly, he redirected spiritual attention. He built the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, not simply as an architectural marvel, but as a political strategy. With the Kaaba having suffered the wounds of war and the memory of rebellion still fresh, the Umayyads attempted to center religious pilgrimage around Jerusalem. Some even promoted it as a new sanctuary. But the hearts of the believers, those who had held on to the legacy of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his Ahl-e-Bait, remained fixed upon the Kaaba, not the Golden Dome. Still, Abdul Malik's power grew, and under his rule, the Umayyad dynasty stabilized. But stability is not always a sign of righteousness. The cost had been too great. A grandson of the Prophet martyred in Karbala, the city of Medina ravaged, and the Kaaba twice besieged and set aflame. These were not just political events, they were spiritual tragedies. Years passed, but the deeper wounds festered. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the man who had led the second siege of Makkah, continued to rise in influence. He ruled Iraq with an iron fist. Known for his eloquence and cruelty, his sermons thundered from the minbar, but they carried no mercy. He is remembered as one who could recite the Quran fluently while ordering the death of the pious without hesitation. His prisons were full, his hands stained. Hajjaj's presence spread fear, but not submission. In secret circles, in desert gatherings and quiet homes, the people still remembered what had been lost. They remembered Ali, whose voice had been silenced. After the Prophet's death, they remembered Fatima, who was buried in the night. They remembered Hussain, poisoned in silence, and Hussain, whose blood soaked the sands of Karbala. And now they remembered Ibn Zubair, whose final stand at the Kaaba echoed that same spirit, standing against oppression even when the world turns away. The house of God had become a battlefield, not just for power, but for memory. There were others who bore witness to this era, men of knowledge and heart, whose legacy would survive the sword. Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, the son of Imam Zainul Abidin, and great-grandson of Imam Ali, began to emerge as a quiet but powerful guide. He watched the rise and fall of tyrants and chose a path of knowledge and preservation. He taught the deeper meanings of the Quran, revealed the spiritual insights hidden beneath the history that had been bloodied, and passed on the message that true Islam was never in palaces. It was in the hearts of the sincere. Under his guidance, the truth was preserved not by armies, but by chains of narration, by students, by whispered hadiths told from father to son, from mother to daughter. The Imams of the Ahl-e-Bait knew that power won by violence would not last, but knowledge rooted in justice would outlive empires. Meanwhile, Hajjaj grew more paranoid. He killed without trial, suppressed revolts, and even rewrote the Quran's punctuation to assert linguistic authority. But despite all his cruelty, he could not erase what the people carried in their hearts: the memory of Karbala, the image of the burning Kaaba, the cries of Ibn Zubair as he stood alone. These were the stories that lived in silence and prayer, passed down through generations. Makkah, though now under Umayyad control, never truly bowed. It carried in its streets the footsteps of those who had resisted. And every pilgrim who performed tawaf around the Kaaba saw not just a cube of black stone, but a monument of struggle, of sacrifice. The Kaaba had survived. It had been cracked and scorched, rebuilt and reshaped, but it stood, and in standing, it bore witness to the history the rulers tried to bury. There's a lesson in this. Not all desecration comes with noise. Sometimes it comes through policy, silence and forgetting, and that's why the remembrance, the dhikr of what happened, must never fade. In later years, new dynasties would rise and fall. The Abbasids would overthrow the Umayyads, claiming to restore the Prophet's family to its rightful place, yet they too would turn on the Ahl-e-Bait. But the Kaaba remained. It endured kings and wars, floods and fire, but it also remained a compass, not just in direction but in truth. For those who sought justice, the Kaaba was not only the Qibla of prayer, it was the Qibla of resistance. And so, when one stood before it, raising hands in supplication, they were not only facing bricks and cloth, they were standing before history, a place where fire once reigned, where blood was once spilled, and where the faithful once stood, not for power, but for the honor of what the Kaaba represented. Ibn Zubayr's last moments were not in a palace or on a throne, but beneath the very sky the Prophet, peace be upon him, had looked upon. He died facing the Kaaba, refusing to surrender to tyranny, and while his body was cut down and his memory smeared by the rulers of the time, history would remember. Just like Karbala, the siege of the Kaaba was not only about violence, it was about clarity, about who stood for the truth when it was most dangerous to do so. And this truth still echoes in the heart of every believer who walks the sacred precincts, who knows that the Kaaba is not just a destination, it is a testament. The fire had been extinguished, the stones had been replaced. But the story was far from over. The Umayyads would fall, new tyrants would rise, and yet every time they sought to erase, there would be those who would remember, because the house of God cannot be destroyed by fire, only by forgetting. Echoes through time and the weight of sacred memory, years passed, like desert winds, quiet yet relentless. The fire that once consumed the house of God had been extinguished, but its memory refused to die. The smoke that once rose from the Kaaba now curled through the pages of history, staining the memory of those who let the sacred burn in pursuit of power. What happened in Makkah was not just a military siege, it was the culmination of a moral collapse, a betrayal not only of individuals, but of the sacred trust inherited from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Umayyad reign, for all, its strength in politics and expansion, was slowly rotting from within. Their claim to leadership was rooted not in spiritual legitimacy, but in brute force and dynastic entitlement. They tried to sanctify their rule with gold, poetry, and architecture. Yet no monument they built could undo the crimes their swords had carved into the hearts of the faithful. Karbala, Medina, and Makkah, the three holiest cities, had all bled under their watch. But history, like the Kaaba, has its own gravity. It pulls truth back from the margins. And the people, those who remembered the Prophet's family, those who wept for Hussain, who whispered of Zainab's sermon in Damascus, who retold the martyrdom of Ibn Zubair beneath the sacred canopy of the Kaaba. They kept the flame of remembrance, alive not with weapons, but with stories, prayer, and sacrifice. Even as the Umayyads continued to build, tax, and govern, they could not command love. They could not compel the hearts of the righteous. Love cannot be legislated, and so resistance took quieter forms. It was in the knowledge passed by the Imams of the Ahl-e-Bait, who never sought power, but always bore the weight of truth. It was in the tears shed during the remembrance of Karbala, and in the reverence shown at the Kaaba, not because it belonged to a caliph, but because it belonged to God. In Medina, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir continued the mission of spiritual restoration. He taught that faith is not just belief, it is responsibility, that silence in the face of tyranny is betrayal. His son, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, would soon rise with a lantern of knowledge so luminous it would enlighten jurists across sects. Yet his allegiance remained with God alone, never to a corrupt throne. These were the descendants of the Prophet, whose legitimacy did not need armies or titles. It lived in their character, in their knowledge, and in their pain. The Umayyads, by contrast, continued to spiral into infighting. After Abdul Malik's death, his sons inherited the throne like spoils of war. Al-Walid, Suleiman, and others each took turns. Some ruled with an iron fist, others with confusion and fear. None could escape the curse of injustice that clung to their dynasty like smoke clings to fire. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the brutal governor of Iraq, who had once commanded the siege against Ibn Zubair, eventually died, unrepentant, feared, but never loved. He had built palaces, filled prisons, and ruled with terror. But at his death, even his allies trembled, unsure whether they had buried a man or a monster, and so the Umayyads began to crack, not from outside invasions, but from within. Their own family feuded, and the people grew weary. The Abbasids, another branch of Quraysh, rose under the banner of revenge for the Prophet's family. They claimed to seek justice for Karbala, for the massacres in Medina, and for the burning of the Kaaba. But revolutions are often louder than their promises. The Abbasids succeeded in toppling the Umayyads. They painted their revolution in black. Flags mourning for the wronged, but soon they too would reveal a hunger for the same thrones soaked in blood. Though they claimed allegiance to Ahl-e-Bait, they did not elevate them. In fact, they imprisoned, poisoned, and silenced the very Imams whose suffering had inspired their rise. The house of God remained silent through it all. It stood through earthquakes and floods, tyrants and pilgrims. And though its structure changed, from The additions and removals of the Hijr Ismail to the various coverings and restorations, it bore one eternal testimony, that sacredness cannot be preserved through tyranny. Every stone of the Kaaba had once trembled under the Prophet's touch. Every corner knew his footsteps. The black stone, though worn smooth by centuries of kisses and tears, remained a silent witness to the unity that had once bound the believers together. But that unity had long splintered. Still, there were those who tried to mend it, not through politics, but through piety. Generations of scholars, lovers of Ahl-e-Bait, and defenders of truth chose a path of remembrance. They visited the Kaaba, not just for Hajj, but to weep where the Prophet once stood. They prayed in Medina, whispering to the grave of Fatima, though none knew her exact resting place, buried in the shadows, hidden by injustice. Among these lovers of truth were poets who dared to write of Karbala, of Ibn Zubair, of the burning Kaaba. Their verses were subtle, their meanings layered. They had to be. Open defiance was crushed, but poetry, like memory, can slip past the guards. Kaaba burned by the hands that claimed to defend it, Zamzam cried, and the black stone darkened. Ashes rose where once angels descended, and still they ask, where is justice? These were not just words. They were wounds. Pilgrims who came to Makkah in later centuries would often hear fragments of these tales. An old man would mention Ibn Zubair's last stand. A woman in tears would recite verses about Hussain. A child might ask why the Kaaba was once attacked, and the answer would be met with silence or a long, trembling sigh. For the righteous, the Kaaba was never just a destination. It was a reminder that even the holiest place on earth could be attacked when power turns blind, that symbols must be defended by the righteous, or else they become tools for the wicked. But above all, it reminded them that the Kaaba belonged to no dynasty, no party, no king. It belonged to Allah, and He watches. In the centuries that followed, many rulers came to Makkah. Some rebuilt the walls, expanded the haram, provided for the pilgrims. Others used it to legitimize their rule. The Kaaba, ever patient, endured them all. But those who loved it truly, those who saw in its cloth the pain of the oppressed, carried a different light. They saw in its shadow the blood of Hussain, the defiance of Zubair, the prayers of Zayn-ul-Abidin, the wisdom of Bakir and Sadiq, the whispers of Fatima, the courage of Ali, and they remembered that the Kaaba was not just attacked with catapults or fire, it was betrayed every time injustice was done in its name, every time a tyrant claimed to defend it while oppressing the people of truth. But they also remembered that it could not be destroyed, not truly, because the Kaaba is not just bricks. It is a mirror, and when you stand before it, what you see is not just a holy structure, but your own heart. What you bring to it is reflected back. If you come with sincerity, you will find mercy. If you come with arrogance, you will find silence. Today, pilgrims circle the Kaaba with tears and hope. Most have never heard of the siege. Few know that fire once rained upon it. Fewer still know of the defiant cry of a man named Abdullah ibn Zubair, who died beneath its shade. But the Kaaba remembers, and perhaps that is enough, because the lesson of that fire is not meant to be shouted from pulpits. It is meant to be carried quietly in the soul, a warning, a truth, that power without justice burns even the holiest things, that the house of God can only be honored by those who honor God's command. In the end, history is not just what is written. It is what survives in the hearts of the sincere. And as long as there are those who weep for Hussain, who whisper prayers beneath the stars, who stand before the Kaaba with trembling hearts and upright backs, the truth will never die. The siege of the Kaaba was more than a moment of destruction. It was a mirror held up to the soul of the Muslim Ummah. It asked a question that still echoes today. What happens when the pursuit of power outweighs the sanctity of the sacred? Abdullah ibn Zubair's death, the raining fire on the house of God, and the silence that followed, They are not just historical facts. They are spiritual tests. They remind us that no place, no symbol, no lineage is safe when justice is abandoned, but they also offer hope, that even amid tyranny there are those who stand firm, that even in darkness the flame of truth can survive, and that the Kaaba, though scarred, still stands, calling us not just to prayer, but to reflection. To circle the Kaaba is to circle the story of Islam itself, with its triumphs and its tragedies, its saints and its betrayals. But with each round we recommit, not to kings or dynasties, but to the truth, and in that truth we find our direction,